Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The summer I turned 17 remains burned into my memory like a brand on cattle hide, not because of any celebration or milestone, but because of what lurked in the shadows of our family's cabin in the remote forests of northern New Mexico. The year was 2020, and everything felt different already. The world had shifted, and so had I. I was struggling that year, caught between childhood and whatever came next. My body felt foreign, my confidence shattered by months of isolation and self-doubt. The mirror had become my enemy, reflecting back a stranger I couldn't recognize. When my parents announced our annual family retreat to the cabin, my stomach twisted with dread. The thought of being trapped in the woods with nowhere to hide felt suffocating. "Fresh air will do you good," Mom insisted, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness parents use when they're worried about their kids. Dad nodded along, but I caught the concerned glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. My younger sister, Penny, bounced around excitedly, already packing her hiking boots and camera. At 14, she still found magic in everything. The cabin sat nestled deep in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly through towering pines and aspens. No cell towers reached this far into the wilderness, just blessed silence and the weight of ancient trees pressing in from all sides. We'd been coming here since I was 7, back when the isolation felt like adventure rather than imprisonment. As we pulled up that first afternoon in late July, I noticed how the shadows seemed deeper than I remembered. The trees pressed closer to the small wooden structure, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. The cabin itself looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable against the vastness of the wilderness surrounding it. Dad killed the engine, and the silence that followed felt almost aggressive in its completeness. No traffic, no neighbors, no distractions, just the four of us and whatever lived in these woods. Penny immediately jumped out and started exploring, her voice echoing strangely among the trees as she called out discoveries of interesting rocks and unusual flowers. Bout. As I hauled my reluctant body from the back seat, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The trees seemed to lean inward, listening. The very air felt thicker, more oppressive than in previous years. Even the birds sounded different, their calls more urgent, more warning than welcoming. That first evening passed quietly enough. We grilled burgers on the old propane grill, played cards by lamplight, and fell into the familiar rhythm of cabin life. But as darkness crept through the windows, I found myself glancing nervously at the glass panes, seeing only black void staring back. I volunteered for cleanup duty, anything to avoid the suffocating quiet of my assigned bedroom. As I scrubbed dishes at the kitchen sink, the window above it framed nothing but impenetrable darkness. The weak porch light barely penetrated 3 feet into the tree line, creating a pitiful circle of yellow glow that only emphasized how vast and unknown the surrounding forest truly was. Penny had already crashed, exhausted from her explorations. Mom and Dad sat in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and speaking in low murmurs about work, bills, normal things that felt impossibly distant in this place. Their voices created a comforting backdrop as I finished the dishes, but underneath their conversation, I became aware of other sounds. The forest was never truly quiet. Insects hummed, branches creaked, small creatures rustled through underbrush. But tonight, these familiar noises seemed to carry an edge of tension. Every snap of a twig made me freeze. Every owl hoot sounded more like a warning than a call. I was drying the last plate when the kitchen window exploded with a thunderous impact that sent glass shards flying across the counter. I screamed, stumbling backward as something large and dark crashed through, bringing with it the smell of decay and wet fur. In the chaos of falling glass and my own terrified shrieks, I caught a glimpse of wings, massive, leathery wings spanning at least 6 feet. The thing thrashed frantically in the sink, its claws scraping against porcelain as it tried to right itself. In the horrible seconds before my parents came running, I saw its face clearly. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something in between that my brain refused to categorize. Its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was utterly wrong, utterly malevolent. Dad burst into the kitchen first, Mom close behind. By then, whatever had crashed through was gone, vanished back into the night through the shattered window. But the evidence remained. Glass everywhere, deep gouges in the wooden windowsill, and 4 parallel scratches across the porcelain sink that looked like claw marks. What happened? Dad's voice was sharp with concern as he surveyed the destruction. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the larger pieces of glass, and I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the gaping hole where the window had been. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. Something had crashed through. Something with wings. Something that looked at me with eyes that held too much awareness. Even as I spoke, I could hear how insane it sounded. Dad and Mom exchanged glances, the kind parents share when they're deciding whether their child is having a breakdown. Probably a bat, Dad said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. They can get disoriented, especially around lights. But bats don't grow to the size of small children. Bats don't leave claw marks an inch deep in solid porcelain. And bats definitely don't carry the stench of rotting meat. We spent the next hour boarding up the window with plywood from Dad's emergency supplies. As he worked, I noticed how frequently he glanced over his shoulder, how he positioned himself so his back was never to the forest. Mom kept Penny occupied in the living room, but I could hear the worry in her voice as she explained about confused wildlife and accidents. That night, I lay in my narrow bed listening to every sound the cabin made. The old wood creaked and settled, floorboards popped, and somewhere in the walls, mice scurried through hidden passages. But underneath it all, I swear I could hear breathing that didn't belong to any of us. Slow, deliberate breaths coming from just outside the thin walls. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, daylight made the previous night's events seem more disturbing rather than less. The boarded window looked like a wound in the cabin's face, and the claw marks in the sink appeared even deeper in the harsh morning light. Dad was already up when I shuffled into the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at the damage with bloodshot eyes. He looked like he'd slept about as well as I had, which is to say, not at all. "Find anything?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He gestured toward the back door with his coffee mug. "Take a look outside, but stay close to the cabin." The back porch faced a small clearing where we usually set up chairs for evening campfires. This morning the area looked like a crime scene. Deep furrows carved the earth in long, parallel lines. Patches of grass were torn up, revealing dark soil underneath. And scattered across the clearing were feathers, not ordinary bird feathers, but massive black plumes, each one nearly as long as my forearm. But it was the trees that made my blood freeze. 20 feet up the trunk of the nearest pine, bark had been stripped away in 4 parallel gouges. The exposed wood underneath gleamed pale and fresh, still weeping sap. Whatever had made those marks possessed incredible strength and equally incredible reach. "Dad," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." He joined me on the porch, and I watched his face pale as he took in the destruction. This wasn't the work of any normal animal. The spacing of the claw marks, the depth of the gouges, the sheer violence of it all. It spoke of something far more dangerous than a confused bat. Yet Penny bounced out to join us, stopping short when she saw our expressions. "What's wrong?" she asked, then caught sight of the clearing. "Whoa, what happened out there?" "Storm damage," Dad said quickly, but even Penny wasn't buying that explanation. No storm could create such precise, deliberate destruction. No wind could strip bark 20 feet up a tree trunk in 4 perfect parallel lines. Mom emerged from the kitchen, took one look at the scene, and immediately began herding Penny back inside. But not before I caught the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was growing in my chest like a tumor. We spent the morning cleaning up, gathering the scattered feathers and trying to restore some normalcy to the clearing. But every few minutes, one of us would pause and scan the tree line, as if expecting something to come crashing out of the shadows. The feathers were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each one was easily 14 inches long, midnight black with an oily sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I held them up to examine them more closely, they felt warm to the touch and carried that same awful smell from the night before, like meat left too long in the sun. "We should go home," I said as we finished collecting the last of the debris. "Pack up and leave. Now." Dad paused in his work, considering. For a moment I thought he might agree. Then he straightened his shoulders and shook his head. "We're not running away from some wild animal. This is our place, too." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Whatever had visited us wasn't just some wild animal, and we all knew it. The question was whether we were brave enough to admit it. The rest of that day passed in tense preparation. Dad drove into the nearest town, a 40-minute journey down treacherous mountain roads, and returned with supplies that had nothing to do with family vacation. Floodlights, motion sensors, trail cameras, and a new rifle that he handled with grim familiarity. "Insurance," he called it, but his hands shook as he loaded ammunition. Mom spent the afternoon researching on her laptop, using the cabin's weak internet connection to search for any reports of unusual animal attacks in the area. What she found didn't offer much comfort. 3 hikers had gone missing in the past month, their backpacks found shredded and scattered across remote trails. A local rancher had lost 6 head of cattle to something that tore them apart and left the pieces scattered like confetti. Mountain lions, the official reports suggested. Unusually aggressive bear behavior. But the photos Mom showed us looked nothing like typical predator kills. These were scenes of pure carnage, as if something had attacked not for food, but for the sheer joy of destruction. Penny, bless her innocence, treated the whole thing like an adventure. She helped Dad install the motion sensors and chatted excitedly about protecting our territory from bears. But I noticed how she stayed closer to the cabin than usual, how her eyes kept drifting upward to scan the branches above us. As evening approached, we retreated inside and went through our new security routine. Every door locked, every window checked twice. The plywood barrier over the kitchen window looked especially ominous as shadows lengthened across it. Dad positioned himself in a chair facing the back clearing, the new rifle across his knees. "Motion sensors will alert us if anything comes within 50 feet, he said, though his voice carried no confidence. "Cameras will record whatever it is." But somehow, I didn't think our uninvited guest would be deterred by human technology. The intelligence I'd seen in those glowing eyes suggested something far more cunning than any ordinary predator. This thing had chosen to attack when we were most vulnerable, most isolated. It had targeted the kitchen window specifically, the one room where someone would be alone and unprepared. Night fell like a curtain, and with it came the familiar sounds of the forest settling into darkness. But tonight, those sounds carried new menace. Every rustle could be something stalking closer. Every creak might be the prelude to attack. We sat in tense silence, ears straining for any sign of movement outside. The motion sensors remained quiet, their small LED lights glowing steadily green. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel eyes watching us from beyond their range. Something patient and intelligent, studying our defenses and finding them wanting. Around midnight, Penny finally succumbed to exhaustion and curled up on the couch. Mom covered her with a blanket and settled into the chair beside Dad, though she jumped at every small noise. I positioned myself at the living room window, peering out through a gap in the curtains at the moonlit clearing. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a shadow among shadows, a darker patch in the already black forest. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into something that made my throat close with terror. It crouched at the very edge of the clearing, just beyond the range of our motion sensors. In the pale moonlight, I could make out its general form, roughly human-sized but wrong in every proportion. Its arms were too long, ending in hands that seemed to possess too many joints. Its head was too large, too angular, with ears that swept back like horns. But it was the wings that confirmed my worst fears. Even folded against its back, they created a silhouette that spoke of impossible flight capabilities. This wasn't some lost bat or confused bird. This was a predator perfectly adapted for hunting in darkness, for striking from above when prey least expected it. For what felt like hours, we stared at each other across that moonlit space. The creature remained absolutely motionless, but I could sense its attention focused on the cabin with laser-like intensity. It was studying us, learning our patterns, planning its next move. I wanted to alert Dad, to point out our uninvited guest, but some instinct warned me to stay perfectly still. Movement might trigger an attack. Sound might provoke it into action. So I remained frozen at the window, watching the watcher, while my family dozed fitfully behind me. The creature's patience was inhuman. It held that crouch for so long I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if stress and fear had conjured a monster from ordinary shadows. But then it moved, just a slight shift of position, a redistribution of weight, and I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the moonlight with hellish intensity. Those eyes held intelligence that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a wild animal operating on instinct. This was something that planned, that reasoned, that took pleasure in the fear it inspired. It knew we were watching. It knew we were afraid. And it was enjoying every second of our terror. As dawn approached, the creature finally stirred from its vigil. It unfolded to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, with wings that spanned at least 12 feet when partially extended. For one heart-stopping moment, it turned its attention directly to the window where I crouched, and I swear it smiled. Not a human smile, but something far more disturbing, a predator's grin that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. Then it was gone, launching itself into the air with a powerful thrust of those massive wings. The sound of its departure, a leathery whoosh followed by the crack of breaking branches, finally woke Dad. "What was that?" he asked, instantly alert, rifle in his hands. "It was here," I managed to say, "all night, watching us." Dad joined me at the window, scanning the empty clearing. The motion sensors had never triggered, our cameras had captured nothing but darkness, but the gouges in the trees remained as proof that something terrible stalked these woods. And now it knew exactly where to find us. The next day, we should have packed up and left. Every rational part of my brain screamed that we were in over our heads, that pride wasn't worth dying for. But Dad had reached some internal decision that I didn't understand until later. "We're not prey," he announced over breakfast, though his hands shook as he poured coffee. "We're not going to cower and run. If there's something dangerous out there, we need to know what it is." Mom tried to argue, but Dad's mind was made up. He spent the day checking and rechecking our defenses, adding more lights, more cameras, more sensors. But I could see the futility in his efforts. Our visitor had already proven it could approach undetected when it chose to. As evening approached, Dad made his final preparations. "Tonight we stay alert, all of us. If this thing wants a confrontation, we'll give it one." He positioned us strategically around the cabin's main room, himself by the back door, Mom at the front window, me watching the sides. Penny protested being sent to bed, but one look at Dad's face silenced her complaints. Whatever was coming, he didn't want her to see it. We didn't have to wait long. The attack began at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was checking my phone when the first motion sensor shrieked its warning. Then another, and another. Something was moving fast around the cabin's perimeter, testing our defenses. Dad raised his rifle, his face grim in the artificial glow of our security lights. "Stay calm," he said, though his voice betrayed his own terror. "Whatever happens, stay together." The motion sensors fell silent. For 30 seconds, we held our breath, waiting. Then came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A scraping, scratching noise from directly above us. Something was on the roof. The scratching moved in a deliberate pattern, following the cabin's ridgeline from end to end. Then it stopped, directly over the living room where we crouched in terrified silence. Through the thin wood and shingles, we could hear breathing. Slow, measured breaths that suggested something far larger than any normal animal. A section of the roof began to sag under incredible weight. Dust sifted down from the ceiling joints as whatever crouched above us shifted position. The scratching resumed, more aggressive now, as claws worked at the shingles and wooden boards that were all that separated us from nightmare. "The roof won't hold," Dad whispered, raising his rifle toward the ceiling. "It's coming through." The attack came from a direction we never expected. While we watched the ceiling in horror, the thing dropped down outside the living room window, the one Mom had been monitoring. In the split second before impact, I caught a perfect view of our stalker. It was even more horrible up close. Its skin looked like wet leather stretched over bones that followed no earthly anatomy. Its face combined the worst features of bat and human into something that should never have existed. But it was the expression in those glowing eyes that froze my blood. Pure, intelligent malice. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. The creature poured through the opening like smoke-given form, moving with fluid grace despite its size. Dad's rifle boomed in the enclosed space, the sound deafening. The bullet struck the thing's center mass and had absolutely no effect. But it turned its attention to Dad with what I can only describe as amusement. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was like wind through a graveyard, a sighing moan that spoke of hunger and patient cruelty. Dad fired again. This time the creature moved, flowing aside like liquid shadow. The bullet buried itself in the wall behind where it had been standing. Before Dad could work the bolt for a third shot, the thing was on him. I have never heard my father scream. Even during his worst injuries, the time he fell from the cabin's roof, the accident with the chainsaw, he might grunt or curse, but never scream. But when those claws raked across his chest, tearing through shirt and skin like paper, the sound that tore from his throat was pure agony. The creature lifted him off the ground with impossible strength, holding him suspended while it examined him like a cat with a caught mouse. Dad's blood dripped steadily onto the floor, each drop loud as thunder in the sudden silence. "Let him go!" Mom shrieked, grabbing a poker from beside the fireplace. "Let him go!" The creature turned its attention to her, and I saw my father's moment of opportunity. With the last of his strength, he drove his hunting knife deep into the thing's neck, burying the blade to the hilt. Set. Black blood fountained from the wound, splashing across the walls like oil. The creature's scream shattered every remaining window in the cabin and probably woke things in the forest that had been sleeping since the dawn of time. It dropped Dad and staggered backward, claws clutching at the wound. For a moment, I thought we'd won. Then those terrible eyes fixed on me, and I realized our victory had come at a price we couldn't afford to pay. The creature was no longer playing with us. Now it was truly angry. What followed was pure chaos. The wounded creature lashed out in fury, its claws shredding furniture and gouging deep furrows in the cabin's log walls. Mom dragged Dad toward the back bedroom while I grabbed the rifle he'd dropped, though I had no idea if bullets could stop something that had already shrugged off 2 direct hits. The thing pursued us with relentless determination, its movements becoming more erratic as black blood continued to pour from the knife wound. It crashed through doorways, splintered walls, and left destruction in its wake like a living tornado. In the narrow hallway, it cornered us. There was nowhere left to run. Dad was barely conscious, leaning heavily against Mom as she tried to support his weight. His shirt was soaked crimson, and his breathing came in short, pained gasps. The creature filled the hallway from floor to ceiling, its wings spread wide enough to touch both walls. In that confined space, it looked even more monstrous, more impossible. Its wounded neck had stopped bleeding, but the hunting knife still protruded from the matted flesh like an accusation. When it spoke, and God help me, it did speak. Its voice was like breaking glass wrapped in velvet. "You hurt me," it said, each word carefully pronounced, despite the inhuman mouth that formed them. "No one hurts me. No one escapes me." I raised the rifle with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold it steady. At this range, I couldn't miss. But I also knew bullets were useless against this thing. Still, I had to try. "Get back," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Leave us alone." The creature laughed, a sound like wind through a slaughterhouse. "Brave little morsel. I'll save you for last. Let you watch while I play with the others." It reached for Mom with one clawed hand, and I pulled the trigger. The bullet took it in the shoulder, spinning it around and sending it crashing into the wall. Black blood splattered across the hallway, but the creature was already recovering, already turning back toward us with renewed fury. That's when Penny appeared. My little sister stood at the far end of the hallway, her pajamas incongruously cheerful in the midst of horror. She held something in her hands. Dad's emergency flare gun, the one he kept for signaling rescue helicopters if someone got hurt during hunting trips.
"Hey, ugly!"
she shouted, her voice high and frightened but determined.
"Pick on someone your own size."
The creature spun toward her with liquid grace, and Penny fired. The flare struck its center mass and exploded in a brilliant burst of red fire. The thing's scream this time wasn't anger or pain. It was pure terror. Fire clung to its leathery hide, spreading with unnatural speed. The creature thrashed wildly, its movements becoming increasingly frantic as the flames consumed more of its body. It crashed through the cabin's front door and stumbled into the night, a living torch that set the surrounding grass ablaze. We followed as far as the porch, watching in stunned silence as our tormentor rolled desperately in the dirt, trying to extinguish flames that seemed to burn from within. Its screams echoed across the forest, and from somewhere in the darkness, other voices answered, howls and shrieks that suggested our visitor hadn't been alone. The creature managed to extinguish most of the flames, but the damage was done. Half its body was charred black, and it moved with obvious pain. It turned back toward us one final time, and the hatred in those glowing eyes was absolute. "This isn't over," it hissed, the words barely recognizable through its damaged throat. "I know your scent now, all of your scents. I'll find you again." Then it launched itself into the air on damaged wings, disappearing into the darkness with a sound like thunder. We stood there for a long time, waiting for it to return, but the forest gradually settled back into normal nighttime quiet. Dad needed a hospital, but the nearest one was 3 hours away, and his truck wouldn't start. Something had torn the engine compartment apart during the attack. We used our emergency satellite phone to call for help, then spent the rest of the night barricaded in what remained of the cabin, taking turns keeping watch. The rescue helicopter arrived at dawn, along with Forest Service officials who took one look at the cabin's destruction and immediately began asking questions we couldn't answer truthfully. Wild animal attack, we told them. Some kind of bear, maybe rabid. They didn't believe us, but they also couldn't offer any better explanation for the claw marks that scored the walls 20 feet above ground level, or the feathers we'd burned but forgotten to dispose of completely, or the patches of vegetation that had died where black blood had spilled. Dad spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The doctor said he was lucky. The claws had missed major organs by inches, but the scars they left behind formed a pattern too deliberate to be random, too precise to be accidental. They looked almost like letters in some alphabet that predated human language. Shit. We never returned to the cabin. Dad sold it through a realtor, sight unseen, to some developer who planned to tear it down and build condominiums. I sometimes wonder if the new owners ever found evidence of what happened there, if they ever wondered about the strange stains that no amount of cleaning could remove from the floorboards. The nightmares started about a week after we got home, not just for me, all of us. Mom would wake up screaming about eyes in the darkness. Dad would patrol the house each night before bed, checking locks that were already secure, testing windows that couldn't open anyway. Penny handled it better than the rest of us, but even she developed habits that spoke to deeper trauma. She never went outside after sunset anymore. She slept with every light in her room burning bright, and she kept Dad's flare gun under her pillow, despite our parents' protests. Years have passed since that summer. I'm 25 now, with the apartment of my own and a job that keeps me busy enough to avoid thinking about the past most days. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the wind sounds like breathing through the windows, I remember those glowing eyes, and wonder if somewhere in the wilderness, something remembers me too. The rational part of my brain insists it was all stress-induced hallucination, shared psychosis brought on by isolation and family tension. Scientists would say there's no such thing as creatures like the one we encountered. They'd point to the lack of physical evidence, the impossibility of something that large remaining hidden in modern times. But I still carry a scar on my forearm from where flying glass caught me during that final attack. Dad's chest bears marks that no earthly animal could have made. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear wings outside my window. Patient, waiting wings that remember a promise made in hatred and pain. I've researched extensively over the years, following every lead about unusual animal attacks, unexplained disappearances, and witnesses who describe encounters with impossible creatures. The stories are out there, scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs leading deeper into a forest I'm not sure I want to explore. What I've learned is this: we're not alone on this planet. The wilderness holds things that predate human civilization, things that remember when we were just another species of prey scurrying through the undergrowth. Most of the time, they stay hidden, content to hunt in shadows while we convince ourselves we've conquered the natural world. But sometimes, when conditions are right and human arrogance ventures too far into their domain, the ancient things remind us that we're not the apex predators we pretend to be. They show us what real horror looks like, what it feels like to be hunted by something that views us as nothing more than amusing entertainment. The creature that stalked my family that summer is still out there somewhere. I know this with absolute certainty, the same way I know my own name. It's patient, intelligent, and utterly vindictive. It made a promise in the ruins of our sanctuary, and things like that don't forget promises. So I stay in the city now, surrounded by steel and concrete, wrapped in the illusion of safety that civilization provides. I avoid camping trips and hiking trails. I keep my apartment brightly lit after sunset. And on nights when the wind sounds too much like breathing, I check the locks twice and pray to God that some hungers are easier to forget than others. But deep down, I know the truth that keeps me awake. Predators never forget the scent of prey that got away. And sooner or later, they always come back to finish what they started. The summer I turned 17 taught me that the world is far more dangerous than we pretend, full of shadows that have teeth and intelligence that wishes us harm. It showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite terror so complete it threatens to stop your heart. Most importantly, it taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about standing together when monsters come calling, about protecting each other even when protection seems impossible. We survived that summer not because we were brave, but because we refused to abandon each other to the darkness. Sometimes, on the rare occasions when we all gather for holidays or special events, the conversation will turn quiet and someone will mention that summer at the cabin. We never say much about it. There's an understanding that some experiences are too terrible for casual discussion. But in those moments of shared silence, I see the same knowledge in everyone's eyes. We know what lurks beyond the edge of human understanding. We've looked into the abyss and somehow lived to tell about it, though we choose not to tell that story to people who wouldn't believe it anyway. The world is full of monsters. Some of them walk on two legs and wear human faces. But others have wings that span the darkness and eyes that burn with hunger older than civilization. They're patient, they're intelligent, and they remember every slight, every wound, every face that dared to fight back. I carry that knowledge with me like a scar that never fully heals. It changes how you see the world, knowing that somewhere beyond the safety of streetlights and locked doors, ancient things wait in patient hunger for the chance to remind humanity of its proper place in the food chain. But I also carry something else from that terrible summer. The memory of my little sister standing in a hallway filled with horror, facing down a nightmare with nothing but courage and a flare gun. The image of my father driving a knife into something that should have been impossible, sacrificing his own safety to protect his family. Yes. Those memories remind me that monsters aren't the only things that hide in darkness. Sometimes, when pushed beyond our limits, ordinary people discover reserves of strength and bravery they never knew existed. We find out what we're really made of when everything civilized falls away and only the most primitive instincts remain. The summer I turned 17, I learned that heroes don't always wear capes or carry magical weapons. Sometimes they're just terrified teenagers with hunting rifles, or 14-year-old girls with emergency flares, or fathers who refuse to let monsters hurt their children, even if it costs them everything. And maybe, in a world full of things that hunt in darkness, that knowledge is worth all the nightmares that came after. Maybe understanding that ordinary people can face extraordinary evil and sometimes win is the most important lesson anyone can learn. The creature that terrorized us might still be out there, nursing its wounds and planning revenge. But it learned something that summer too, that human beings, for all their fragility, don't go quietly into the darkness. We fight. We protect our own. And sometimes, just sometimes, we emerge from horror stronger than we entered it. That has to be enough. Because in a universe where monsters are real and patient, the only alternative to hope is surrender, and surrendering to darkness is a choice I refuse to make. The oppressive heat that July afternoon in 2018 felt like a living thing, pressing against my skin with malicious intent. At 28, I thought I knew the mountains around Salt Lake City well enough, but Marcus and I had chosen an unfamiliar trail that snaked through dense undergrowth about 15 miles northeast of the city. The vegetation clawed at our hiking clothes with persistent hunger, thorns catching fabric and skin alike as we pushed deeper into territory that felt increasingly hostile. Sweat stung my eyes as we finally stumbled into a small clearing where towering firs created an ominous canopy overhead. The air hung thick and stagnant, carrying scents of decay and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my throat tighten involuntarily. What immediately drew my attention, however, were the trees themselves. Several massive trunks leaned against each other in an unnatural formation, their bark scarred and stripped in places that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than natural growth patterns. Marcus wiped perspiration from his forehead and squinted at the bizarre arrangement. "Campers, maybe?" he suggested, but his voice carried doubt. "Some kind of shelter attempt?" I studied the formation more closely, noting how the largest logs formed almost perfect angles, their positioning too precise for random storm damage. Each trunk showed signs of being dragged or pushed, with deep gouges in the earth marking their movement. The sight triggered an uncomfortable sensation in my chest, as if my body recognized danger before my mind could process it. We had barely settled against some fallen logs to rest when the forest around us exploded with sound. The crash that shattered the afternoon silence wasn't the gentle rustle of wind through leaves or the snap of a single branch. This was violence, the sound of something massive forcing its way through dense vegetation with complete disregard for the obstacles in its path. Branches splintered with sharp cracks that echoed off the surrounding hills, followed by the heavy thud of disturbed earth. My head jerked toward the source of the commotion, adrenaline flooding my system as my eyes searched frantically through the shadows. Deep within the maze of overlapping branches and twisted undergrowth, movement caught my attention. Through the gloom, I glimpsed a form approximately 6 feet in height moving with purpose through the brush. Dark brown hair covered most of its visible form, with distinctive patches of lighter coloring around what appeared to be its midsection, then returning to darker tones along its lower extremities. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps another hiker wearing unusually heavy clothing, though the temperature made such attire impossible. Maybe a large animal, though no bear or elk moved with such deliberate bipedal motion. The figure navigated the dense undergrowth with unsettling ease, never stumbling or hesitating despite the challenging terrain. "Hello?" I called out, my voice emerging higher and tighter than intended. "Is someone there?" Marcus had already risen to his feet, pushing aside low-hanging branches in an attempt to gain a clearer view. The silence that followed my call felt oppressive, as if the entire forest had collectively held its breath. No response came, not even the natural sounds of birds or small animals that should have populated such an environment. We crept forward cautiously, scanning the ground for any evidence of passage. The thick layer of pine needles revealed only a single, unmistakable impression, a depression far larger and deeper than any human foot could create. The print stretched nearly 18 inches in length, with what appeared to be toe impressions at one end and a heel mark that had compressed the organic matter several inches into the earth. My size 11 hiking boots looked absurdly small beside the impression. The sight sent ice through my veins, though I struggled to maintain composure. We strained our ears, hoping for additional sounds that might provide clues about whatever had created such a mark. The silence stretched on, absolute and unnatural, as if every living creature in the immediate area had fled. Standing in that clearing, surrounded by the evidence of something beyond normal explanation, I felt the first tendrils of genuine fear beginning to take root. The oppressive heat seemed to intensify, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. Despite every instinct screaming that we should investigate further, a deeper survival mechanism urged immediate departure. The hairs on my arms stood erect as we finally decided to continue along the trail, leaving the mysterious formation and its secrets behind. Every few steps, I found myself glancing backward, half expecting to see that hairy figure emerge from the shadows. The simple day hike I had planned had transformed into something else entirely, a journey that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness around my home. Sleep proved elusive in the days following our encounter. Each time I closed my eyes, vivid images flooded my mind. The unnatural arrangement of trees, that massive footprint pressed deep into the forest floor, and most disturbing of all, the fleeting glimpse of something that moved with intelligence through the undergrowth. The memory replayed with obsessive persistence, each detail becoming more pronounced rather than fading as memories typically do. During daylight hours, rational explanations felt possible. Perhaps the heat had affected my perception, or shadows had created illusions that my mind interpreted as something extraordinary. But in the darkness of my bedroom, surrounded by the familiar sounds of civilization, those explanations crumbled. The encounter had possessed a quality of absolute reality that no amount of rationalization could diminish. Marcus experienced similar difficulties adjusting to normal routine. When we spoke by phone 3 days later, his voice carried the same undercurrent of unease that had been plaguing me. "I keep thinking about that print," he admitted. "I've been researching online, looking at photos of bear tracks, elk prints, anything that might explain what we saw." "And?" I prompted, though I suspected his research had yielded the same troubling conclusions as my own. "Nothing comes close. The size, the shape, the depth of the impression. It doesn't match any known animal in this region. Hell, it doesn't match any known animal anywhere." The admission hung between us, carrying implications neither of us wanted to acknowledge directly. We had both reached the same inevitable conclusion. We needed to return. The question wasn't whether we would go back, but when and with whom. "We can't do this alone," I stated, voicing what we both understood. "If there's something out there, something that can leave prints like that and move through the forest with such power, we need backup." Marcus agreed readily, relief evident in his voice. "I've been thinking the same thing. Jamie and Preston might be interested. They're both experienced hikers, and Jamie has that new camera equipment from her photography work." The prospect of additional companions provided some comfort, though it also intensified the weight of what we were proposing. By involving others, we were acknowledging that our experience transcended simple misidentification or heat-induced hallucination. We were admitting that something genuinely unknown inhabited the forests near our city, something that warranted investigation despite the obvious risks. Jamie Morrison, a freelance photographer in her early 30s, possessed both the technical skills to document any discoveries and the skeptical mindset that would help evaluate our claims objectively. Preston, her longtime hiking partner, brought practical outdoor experience and a level-headed approach to problem solving. When we contacted them, their initial reactions followed predictable patterns, polite interest mixed with barely concealed doubt. "You're talking about Bigfoot," Jamie said during our meeting at a local coffee shop, her tone suggesting gentle mockery. "You realize how that sounds, right?"
Yes.
"I realize how it sounds," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "I also know what I saw. And more importantly, I know what evidence we found. If you're not interested, I understand completely, but we're going back either way." Preston leaned forward, his expression more serious than his companion's. "Describe the footprint again. Exact dimensions, depth, any details about toe impressions or gait pattern." I provided the description as precisely as memory allowed, noting the 18-inch length, the significant depth that had compressed layers of organic material, and the general shape that suggested a foot structure unlike any known animal. Preston's skepticism visibly diminished as I spoke, replaced by growing curiosity. "That's substantial," he admitted. "If you're describing it accurately, we're talking about something that weighs several hundred pounds, moves on 2 legs, and has feet that don't match any documented species." Jamie's expression had also shifted, her initial amusement giving way to genuine interest. "Assuming you're not completely delusional," she said with a slight smile, "this could be significant. At minimum, it's worth documenting properly." We spent the next hour planning our return expedition. Unlike our initial casual hike, this venture would require serious preparation. We needed additional supplies, proper documentation equipment, emergency communication devices, and most importantly, a clear strategy for what to do if we encountered whatever had left that massive footprint. The preparation phase lasted nearly a week, during which my anticipation and anxiety grew in equal measure. Each night brought dreams of shadowy figures moving through dense vegetation, accompanied by sounds that human vocal cords could never produce. I found myself jumping at unexpected noises, constantly scanning wooded areas during my daily commute, and experiencing a persistent sensation of being observed. By the time we assembled for our second expedition, my nerves had reached a state of constant tension. The 4 of us gathered at the trailhead before dawn, our backpacks loaded with cameras, audio recording equipment, sample collection materials, and enough emergency supplies to handle unexpected overnight circumstances. The eastern horizon showed the first hints of daylight as we began our ascent into territory that had haunted my thoughts for over a week. The pre-dawn darkness that surrounded us as we began our second expedition carried an oppressive quality that seemed to muffle sound and distort perception. Our flashlight beams created narrow tunnels of visibility through the dense undergrowth, but beyond those cones of artificial light, the forest remained impenetrable and threatening. Every shadow could conceal watching eyes. Every sound might herald approaching danger. Jamie adjusted her camera equipment as we walked, checking settings and battery levels with the methodical precision of a professional. "If we encounter anything unusual, don't move suddenly," she instructed. "Sudden movements can trigger aggressive responses in wild animals, and they'll also ruin any photographic evidence." Preston carried a GPS device and emergency beacon, marking our route with waypoints that would allow rescue teams to locate us if circumstances deteriorated. His military background showed in the systematic way he approached the unknown terrain, constantly evaluating potential escape routes and defensive positions. As daylight gradually penetrated the canopy above, the forest around us revealed details that I hadn't noticed during our first visit. Scratch marks scarred numerous tree trunks at heights that suggested something much larger than any known regional wildlife. The bark had been stripped away in parallel grooves, each mark appearing fresh despite the lack of sap bleeding from the wounds. "Look at these," Preston called out, kneeling beside a cluster of saplings that had been twisted and broken in a pattern that defied natural explanation. The young trees hadn't been snapped by wind or weather. Instead, they showed evidence of deliberate manipulation, bent and woven together in a configuration that served no obvious purpose. Marcus examined the damaged vegetation with growing unease. This looks intentional, like something was marking territory or sending a message. The thought that we might be dealing with an intelligence capable of symbolic communication sent fresh adrenaline through my system. Animals marked territory through scent or simple scratches, but this displayed a level of complexity that suggested reasoning ability. If whatever inhabited this area possessed sufficient intelligence to create territorial markers, it might also possess the intelligence to perceive us as threats. We reached the clearing with the teepee-like formation of logs as the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the canopy. In daylight, the structure appeared even more unnatural than memory had suggested. The logs had been arranged with geometric precision, their placement requiring significant strength and spatial reasoning. Measuring the largest trunk, we determined it weighed several hundred pounds, far beyond the lifting capacity of any individual human. Jamie began photographing the formation from multiple angles while Preston took detailed measurements. The precision of the construction became more apparent under close examination. Each log had been positioned to bear weight efficiently, creating a framework that could potentially support additional material. The configuration suggested not just intelligence, but engineering knowledge. "This isn't random," Jamie stated as she reviewed images on her camera display. "Whatever built this understood structural principles. See how each support log is angled to distribute weight toward the center? This is sophisticated construction." As we documented the site, an overwhelming sensation of being observed began to intensify. The feeling started as a vague unease, but gradually developed into absolute certainty that unseen eyes were tracking our every movement. The back of my neck prickled constantly, and peripheral vision seemed to catch movement that vanished when examined directly. Preston felt it too. His posture became increasingly alert, his attention divided between our documentation efforts and scanning the surrounding vegetation. "We're not alone," he said quietly, his voice carrying the confidence of someone trained to recognize threat indicators. The admission that I wasn't imagining the sensation provided little comfort. If experienced military training confirmed the presence of an observer, our situation had moved from potentially dangerous to actively threatening. Whatever watched us possessed sufficient stealth to remain completely hidden despite our heightened awareness and systematic searching. Marcus had been examining the base of the structure when he discovered something that made his breath catch audibly. "Over here," he called, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." Embedded in the soft earth around the log formation were additional footprints, these even clearer than the single impression we had found previously. The prints formed a rough circle around the structure, suggesting that whatever had built it also regularly patrolled the perimeter. Each impression showed remarkable detail, individual toe marks, arch structure, and heel patterns that matched no known species. "My God," Jamie whispered as she began photographing the prints. "These are incredible. The detail, the size, the clear anatomical structure. This is going to change everything." But even as excitement over the discovery grew, the sensation of being watched intensified to an almost unbearable degree. The observer was close now, very close, and our presence at its construction site was clearly not welcome. The forest around us had fallen into that same unnatural silence we had experienced during our first encounter, as if every living creature recognized approaching danger and sought concealment. Stay. That's when we heard the breathing. The sound that froze our blood wasn't the rapid panting of an animal in distress, or the measured breathing of a sleeping creature. This was deep, deliberate respiration that carried an unmistakable quality of control and awareness. Each inhalation lasted several seconds, followed by equally prolonged exhalations that seemed to emerge from multiple locations around our position. We stood motionless, our own breathing unconsciously synchronized with the rhythm that surrounded us. The sound suggested massive lung capacity, far exceeding human norms, but also indicated conscious regulation that implied higher intelligence. Whatever watched us was managing its respiration to remain concealed while maintaining optimal oxygen intake for potential sudden movement. Preston's military training became evident as he slowly raised his hand, signaling for absolute stillness. His eyes moved constantly, attempting to pinpoint the source of the breathing without making sudden movements that might trigger aggressive action. The GPS device on his belt showed our exact coordinates, but that information would prove useless if we never had opportunity to transmit it. Jamie's camera remained ready, though she made no attempt to raise it toward the sounds. The breathing seemed to shift position periodically, suggesting our observer was mobile and possibly circling our location. Each time the sound moved, it demonstrated remarkable stealth. No snapping branches, no rustling vegetation, just the barely audible displacement of air that indicated something very large moving with impossible quiet. Minutes passed in this suspended state. Our nerves stretched to breaking point as we waited for either revelation or attack. The breathing continued its measured pattern, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind us, other times emanating from the dense undergrowth to our left or right. The creature was definitely circling, studying us with the patience of a predator evaluating potential prey. Then, without warning, the breathing stopped entirely. The silence that followed felt more threatening than the sounds had been. At least while we could hear our observer, we maintained some awareness of its location. Now it could be anywhere. Directly behind us, crouched in the vegetation ahead, or positioned above us in the thick canopy. The complete absence of sound suggested either departure or preparation for action, and neither possibility provided comfort. Marcus was the first to break discipline, turning his head slowly to scan the area behind our position. The movement triggered an immediate response, a low, resonant vocalization that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The sound wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a call, but carried unmistakable warning. Whatever watched us possessed vocal capabilities far beyond any known animal, producing tones that seemed designed to inspire fear rather than communicate specific information. The vocalization lasted nearly 10 seconds, during which I felt my courage rapidly deteriorating. The sound penetrated not just my ears but my entire body, creating vibrations in my chest cavity that suggested massive vocal cords operating at frequencies designed to intimidate. By the time the call faded, my legs were trembling and my mouth had gone completely dry. Preston made a slow, deliberate movement, placing his backpack on the ground and removing the emergency beacon. The device would alert rescue services to our location, but help would require hours to arrive. If our situation deteriorated into immediate physical confrontation, we would face whatever inhabited this territory without assistance. "We need to withdraw," he said quietly, his voice barely audible even in the profound silence. "Slowly, carefully, but we need to move away from this location." Jamie nodded agreement while securing her camera equipment. The photographs she had taken might prove invaluable for scientific analysis, but only if we survived to share them. Marcus began backing away from the log formation, his movements measured and non-threatening. As we began our careful retreat, additional signs of intelligence became apparent throughout the immediate area. Tree branches had been woven together at various heights, creating what appeared to be surveillance blinds that would allow concealed observation of the clearing. The construction showed sophisticated understanding of camouflage principles, using natural materials to create artificial concealment. More disturbing were the arranged stones we discovered as we moved away from the central structure. River rocks had been placed in geometric patterns around the perimeter, each arrangement too precise to result from natural processes. The patterns meant nothing to us, but they clearly held significance for whatever had created them. Possibly territorial markers, possibly communication symbols, possibly warning signs we lacked the knowledge to interpret. The breathing resumed as we reached the edge of the clearing, but now it followed us. Our observer was tracking our departure, maintaining surveillance while allowing withdrawal. The behavior suggested territorial rather than predatory motivation, We were being escorted away rather than stalked for attack. The realization provided minimal comfort. Territorial behavior implied that we had intruded upon claimed space, and the creature's response would depend entirely upon whether it perceived our retreat as sufficient compliance or merely tactical repositioning. If it suspected we might return with additional humans or equipment, tolerance could quickly transform into active hostility. As we gained distance from the central clearing, the sensation of being watched gradually diminished. The breathing faded until we could no longer distinguish it from normal forest sounds, and the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the encounter began to lift. However, none of us relaxed completely. We had penetrated territory belonging to something that possessed both physical power and strategic intelligence, and our brief visit had clearly been tolerated rather than welcomed. The implications of what we had discovered were staggering. Evidence of tool use, structural engineering, territorial marking, and sophisticated surveillance techniques pointed toward an intelligence that challenged fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness. Whatever inhabited the forest near Salt Lake City possessed capabilities that scientific community insisted were impossible for any undiscovered species. Yet the evidence surrounded us, too extensive, too detailed, and too systematically organized to dismiss as coincidence or misinterpretation. Our retreat from the central clearing led us deeper into terrain that showed increasing signs of occupation and modification. What had initially appeared to be virgin wilderness revealed itself under closer examination to be carefully managed territory, shaped by an intelligence that understood both concealment and efficiency. Every 100 yards brought new evidence that we were not dealing with random animal behavior, but with systematic territorial control. Preston discovered the first cache about half a mile from the log formation. Hidden beneath a natural overhang created by fallen boulders, someone or something had stored a collection of objects that defied easy categorization. Smooth river stones arranged in precise geometric patterns surrounded a central pile of what appeared to be tools, sharp-edged rocks that had been deliberately chipped to create cutting implements, wooden stakes that had been stripped and pointed with obvious care.
This is a tool-making site,
Jamie said, her voice tight with awe and fear.
Look at the consistency of the work, the systematic approach to material selection. This represents planning, foresight, and skill development over extended periods.
The tools showed evidence of regular use and maintenance. Cutting edges had been resharpened multiple times. Wooden implements bore the smooth patina that comes from repeated handling, and the entire cache was organized with logical efficiency. Most unsettling was the freshness of the site. No dust accumulation, no weather damage, no signs of abandonment. Marcus examined the surrounding area and found additional disturbing evidence.
There are more footprints here, he reported, multiple sizes, suggesting this area sees regular traffic from more than one individual. The discovery that we might be dealing with a population rather than a solitary creature sent fresh terror through my system. A single unknown entity posed manageable risk. We could potentially avoid contact or negotiate some form of peaceful coexistence. Multiple creatures capable of tool use and territorial organization represented a threat beyond our ability to assess or control. As we continued our exploration, the scope of the territorial modifications became increasingly apparent. Trees had been deliberately killed by ring barking, creating strategic clearings that would provide sight lines for surveillance. Natural game trails had been altered by the placement of obstacles, forcing wildlife to follow paths that could be easily monitored. Most sophisticated were the artificial water collection systems, carved channels that directed rainwater into natural depressions, creating reliable drinking sources during dry periods.
This is habitat engineering, Preston observed, his military training providing framework for understanding the tactical implications. Whoever or whatever controls this territory has modified it to support extended occupation while maintaining strategic advantage over any intruders. The engineering projects showed remarkable understanding of environmental principles. Water collection systems took advantage of natural topography while minimizing visible alteration of the landscape. Surveillance positions provided excellent visibility while remaining virtually undetectable from below. Escape routes had been prepared by removing obstacles and creating concealed paths through dense vegetation. Jamie documented everything with increasing excitement, though her enthusiasm was tempered by growing awareness of our vulnerability. "This is anthropological gold mine," she said. "Evidence of tool use, environmental modification, territorial organization. We're looking at sophisticated culture that's remained completely hidden from scientific observation." But, as her statement hung in the air, we all realized the implications of complete concealment. If this population had successfully avoided detection despite existing so close to major urban areas, they possessed capabilities for stealth and territory defense that made our continued presence extremely dangerous. We were documenting evidence of intelligence while remaining under constant surveillance by that same intelligence. The afternoon sun had begun to sink toward the western horizon when we made the most disturbing discovery of our expedition. Hidden in a dense grove of aspens, partially concealed by carefully arranged branches and vegetation, was what could only be described as a shelter. The structure incorporated living trees as support posts, with additional wooden beams that had been precisely shaped and fitted without the use of metal fasteners or modern construction techniques. The shelter showed evidence of regular habitation. The floor had been covered with layers of pine needles and moss, creating a soft surface that would provide insulation and comfort. Ventilation had been carefully planned, with gaps in the roof structure that would allow smoke to escape while preventing rain penetration. Most unsettling were the personal items, carved wooden objects whose purpose we couldn't determine, but which clearly represented artistic expression rather than mere functionality. "We need to leave," I said, my voice hoarse with fear. "We're not just observing their territory anymore. We're inside their home." The others agreed immediately. Discovering a permanent dwelling structure meant we had penetrated far deeper into occupied territory than prudent exploration warranted. If the inhabitants returned to find us examining their shelter, our presence would likely be interpreted as a direct threat requiring immediate response. As we began our rapid withdrawal, the forest around us seemed to come alive with subtle sounds that suggested coordinated movement. Branches rustled in patterns that indicated deliberate rather than random displacement, and occasional distant calls echoed between hills in sequences that resembled communication rather than animal vocalizations. "They're tracking us," Preston said quietly. "Multiple individuals staying parallel to our route, probably preparing to intercept if we move in the wrong direction." The realization that we were being herded by multiple unknown entities turned our retreat into barely controlled panic. Every shadow could conceal watching eyes. Every sound might herald approaching confrontation. The territory that had seemed merely mysterious during our initial exploration now revealed itself as a carefully controlled domain where we existed only at the sufferance of its true inhabitants. Our hiking pace increased beyond sustainable levels as fear overcame endurance considerations. The trail that had seemed relatively easy during our inward journey now appeared to stretch endlessly ahead, each turn potentially bringing us face to face with creatures that possessed every possible advantage over our small, isolated group. By the time we reached familiar territory near the trailhead, exhaustion had combined with terror to create a state of near hysteria. We had discovered evidence of a hidden civilization existing within miles of urban development, but our documentation had been accomplished at the cost of demonstrating our own vulnerability to beings whose capabilities remained completely unknown. The implications would haunt us for weeks to come. The evidence we had gathered during our second expedition demanded serious consideration of possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about undiscovered species and territorial occupation. 3 weeks passed before any of us felt prepared to discuss what we had witnessed, and even then, our conversations carried undertones of doubt and fear that made rational analysis nearly impossible. Jamie's photographs provided undeniable documentation of sophisticated construction techniques, tool manufacture, and environmental modification. The images showed clear evidence of intelligence applied systematically over extended periods, but they also captured subtle details that suggested we had barely glimpsed the surface of a complex territorial system. "Look at this sequence," she said, spreading prints across my kitchen table during one of our analysis sessions. "The water collection channels show engineering principles that account for seasonal flow variations. Whoever designed these systems understood hydrology, soil composition, and long-term climate patterns." Preston had used his military contacts to research similar incidents in other mountainous regions, discovering scattered reports of unexplained territorial modifications that matched our observations. Most investigations had been abandoned due to lack of institutional support, but the pattern of discoveries suggested our encounter represented part of a much larger phenomenon. There are similar reports from the Cascade Range, the Appalachians, even remote areas of Canada, he explained. Always the same elements: sophisticated construction, tool use, territorial marking, and complete avoidance of human contact. The consistency suggests either coordinated behavior across vast distances or parallel evolution of similar capabilities. Marcus had become obsessed with analyzing the vocalizations we had recorded during our encounters. Using audio software borrowed from his workplace, he had isolated and enhanced the sounds until their non-animal characteristics became undeniable. The vocal calls showed tonal complexity and duration patterns that implied language rather than simple emotional expression. "These aren't animal sounds," he stated with absolute confidence. "The frequency modulation, the rhythmic patterns, the way different calls seem to respond to each other. We're dealing with a communication system that may be more sophisticated than human language." The accumulating evidence forced us to confront a possibility that none of us wanted to acknowledge directly. We had discovered proof of an undocumented intelligent species that had successfully concealed its existence for centuries. The implications were staggering from scientific, social, and personal perspectives. If such beings existed in sufficient numbers to maintain territorial control over significant areas, their continued concealment required capabilities that made human contact extremely dangerous. They had avoided detection through combination of intelligence, stealth, and presumably elimination of threats to their secrecy. Our repeated intrusions into their territory had likely identified us as precisely such a threat. "We have to go back," Jamie announced during our fourth analysis session. "The evidence we've gathered is incredible, but it's not complete. We need direct contact, clear documentation of the beings themselves, proof that will convince the scientific community that we're dealing with something extraordinary." The proposal terrified me, though I recognized its inevitability. The partial evidence we had collected would be dismissed as elaborate hoax or misinterpretation unless supported by irrefutable proof of the creature's existence. But attempting direct contact carried risks that might prove fatal for all involved. Preston opposed the idea initially, his military training emphasizing the dangers of engaging unknown entities possessing superior territorial knowledge and physical capabilities. "We're talking about approaching beings that have successfully avoided human contact for centuries," he argued. "They've maintained that separation through intelligence, stealth, and probably violence when necessary. Forcing contact could trigger exactly the response they've worked so hard to prevent." But Jamie's determination proved infectious. The scientific significance of our discoveries outweighed personal safety considerations, at least in her perspective. "This could be the most important anthropological discovery in human history," she insisted. "We can't walk away because of theoretical dangers." After days of debate, we reached compromise. We would return one final time, but with extensive preparation and safety measures. Emergency beacons would be activated before entering the territory, providing rescue services with our exact location and status. Communication equipment would allow real-time contact with outside support. Most importantly, we would approach their territory openly, making no attempt at concealment that might be interpreted as hostile reconnaissance. The preparation phase lasted 2 weeks and included physical conditioning, equipment testing, and development of contingency plans for various scenarios. We studied everything available about non-human intelligence, interspecies communication, and peaceful contact protocols. Most research proved irrelevant to our situation, but the process helped us think systematically about the unprecedented challenges we would face. Preston insisted on additional safety measures, including cached supplies positioned along our intended route and arrangement for regular check-ins with external contacts who would alert authorities if we failed to report as scheduled. The preparations made our expedition feel like military operation rather than scientific inquiry, but the complexity reflected the genuine dangers we expected to encounter. As our departure date approached, my anxiety reached levels that made normal daily functioning nearly impossible. Dreams featured shadowy figures moving through dense forest, accompanied by vocalizations that seemed designed to inspire terror rather than communicate information. During waking hours, I found myself constantly scanning wooded areas during my commute, imagining that hidden eyes tracked my movements even in suburban environments. The night before our final expedition, none of us managed more than a few hours of fitful rest. We had committed ourselves to direct contact with beings whose capabilities remained largely unknown, in territory where they possessed every possible advantage. The scientific value of potential discoveries provided motivation, but it could not eliminate the very real possibility that we might not survive the encounter. Bombs. Our equipment included audio recording devices, high-resolution cameras, sample collection materials, and enough emergency supplies to survive several days if circumstances prevented immediate withdrawal. Most importantly, we carried no weapons. An intentional decision that we hoped would be interpreted as peaceful intent rather than vulnerability. As dawn approached, we gathered at the trailhead for what we all understood might be our final journey into territory that belonged to beings whose existence challenged everything science claimed to understand about intelligence, evolution, and the natural world. The morning of our final expedition dawned with crystalline clarity that made every detail of the landscape appear hyper-real and threatening. As we began our ascent into territory that had haunted my thoughts for weeks, the familiar weight of being observed settled over us like a shroud. This time, however, the sensation carried different implications. We were no longer accidental intruders, stumbling upon evidence of unknown inhabitants. We were deliberate visitors, seeking direct contact with beings that had clearly demonstrated their desire for concealment. By the time we reached the central clearing with its teepee formation of logs, the feeling of surveillance had intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Multiple observers tracked our movements, their presence felt rather than seen, their attention focused with the intensity of predators evaluating potential prey. The breathing sounds that had characterized our previous encounter were absent, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even our own footsteps. Preston activated our emergency beacon and established communication with our external contact, reporting our arrival at the first checkpoint. The brief radio conversation felt like contact with another world, the normal human realm of technology and urban civilization that existed just miles away, but felt completely separated from our current reality. "They know we're here," Jamie whispered, adjusting her camera settings for optimal documentation. "The question is whether they'll reveal themselves or simply wait for us to leave." As if summoned by her words, movement became visible in the dense undergrowth surrounding the clearing. Not the quick, furtive motion we had glimpsed during previous encounters, but deliberate, controlled displacement that suggested multiple entities positioning themselves for optimal observation. They were no longer hiding their presence, though they remained concealed enough to avoid clear identification. Marcus began setting up audio recording equipment, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering aggressive response. The microphones would capture any vocalizations with sufficient clarity for detailed analysis, potentially providing crucial evidence of language capabilities. As he worked, the rustling in the surrounding vegetation increased, indicating that our activities were generating significant interest among our observers. The first clear vocalization emerged from the forest approximately 20 minutes after our arrival. The sound was unlike anything in our previous recordings, a complex sequence of tones that lasted nearly 30 seconds and seemed to originate from multiple sources. The vocalizations overlapped and intertwined in patterns that suggested coordinated communication rather than random animal calls. "That's definitely language," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Complex syntax, tonal variation, coordinated timing between multiple speakers. We're listening to conversation in an unknown language." As the vocalizations continued, they began to include what sounded like references to our presence. Certain tonal sequences were repeated whenever one of us moved or adjusted equipment, suggesting that our actions were being described or discussed in real time. The implications were staggering. We were not just being observed, but actively analyzed by beings capable of sophisticated linguistic communication. Jamie began photographing the areas where movement was most visible, though the dense vegetation prevented clear images of our observers. The camera's autofocus system worked constantly, trying to lock onto shapes that remained frustratingly indistinct. Occasionally, brief glimpses of dark hair or powerful limbs appeared between branches, but never long enough for definitive documentation. Then, without warning, the forest fell completely silent. The sudden absence of sound felt more threatening than the vocalizations had been. During the communication phase, we had at least maintained some awareness of our observers' locations and activities. Now, they could be anywhere. Directly behind us, positioned overhead in the canopy, or approaching through concealed routes we couldn't anticipate. Preston drew his emergency flare gun, the only weapon-like device we had brought. The flare would provide minimal defensive capability, but its brilliant illumination might disorient attackers long enough to allow escape. His military training was evident in the systematic way he evaluated potential cover positions and escape routes, though the tactical situation offered few encouraging options. That's when we saw them clearly for the first time. 3 figures emerged from different positions around the clearing's perimeter, moving with coordinated precision that indicated both intelligence and strategic planning. Each stood approximately 7 feet in height, with powerful builds that suggested immense physical strength. Their bodies were covered in dark hair that showed lighter patches around the chest and shoulders, exactly matching the coloration patterns we had glimpsed during previous encounters. But their faces were what stopped our breath entirely. The features were unmistakably hominid. Prominent brow ridges, deep-set eyes that showed obvious intelligence, facial structures that combined human and ape characteristics in ways that challenged biological categorization. They watched us with focused attention that left no doubt about their cognitive capabilities, their expressions showing curiosity mixed with obvious wariness. Jamie's camera clicked rapidly as she documented the encounter, though her hands shook with adrenaline that made focusing difficult. The beings seemed aware of the photographic activity but showed no obvious alarm, suggesting they understood the non-threatening nature of the equipment. The largest individual, positioned directly across the clearing from our location, began what could only be described as deliberate communication attempt. The vocalizations were directed specifically toward us, with tonal patterns and rhythmic structures that seemed designed to convey non-aggressive intent. The sounds were repeated with slight variations, as if the being was attempting to find frequencies or patterns we might understand. "It's trying to talk to us," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Actual communication attempt, not just territorial warning or threat display. I found myself fighting every instinct that screamed for immediate retreat. The beings were close enough to reach us in seconds if they chose aggressive action, but their body language suggested curiosity rather than hostility. This was first contact with an unknown intelligent species, and our response would likely determine whether future interactions remained possible. Slowly, carefully, I raised my hands in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. The largest being tilted its head slightly, studying the gesture with obvious interest. Then, incredibly, It raised its own massive hands in what appeared to be an attempt to mirror my behavior. The moment stretched endlessly, two different species attempting rudimentary communication across an evolutionary gap that science insisted was impossible. Around us, the forest held its breath, as if the natural world recognized the significance of what was occurring. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the beings began to withdraw. Their retreat was coordinated and controlled, with each individual backing away while maintaining visual contact with our group. Within minutes, they had vanished into the dense undergrowth, leaving us standing in the clearing with racing hearts and the profound realization that everything we thought we knew about human uniqueness had just been shattered. The silence that followed the being's withdrawal felt different from any quiet I had ever experienced. It carried the weight of revelation, the profound understanding that our small group had just participated in an event that would reshape human understanding of intelligence, evolution, and our place in the natural world. We stood motionless for several minutes, processing what had occurred while scanning the forest for any indication that our observers remained nearby. Jamie's hands trembled as she reviewed the images captured during the encounter. The camera display showed clear, unmistakable documentation of the beings, their faces, their coordinated movements, their obvious intelligence expressed through body language and vocalization patterns. The evidence was irrefutable, yet so extraordinary that accepting its implications required fundamental revision of scientific assumptions.
"These photographs will change everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clear evidence of an unknown hominid species, demonstrating tool use, language capabilities, and sophisticated territorial organization. The anthropological community won't know how to process this." Marcus reviewed audio recordings with growing excitement, isolating vocal sequences that showed unmistakable linguistic structure. The beings had demonstrated syntax, tonal variation, and coordinated communication that met every definition of language. More significantly, their attempt at communication with us suggested cognitive flexibility and cultural sophistication far beyond any known animal capabilities.
"We're looking at evidence of a parallel evolutionary path," he explained. "A hominid species that developed intelligence independently of human lineage, possibly over hundreds of thousands of years. Their successful concealment suggests capabilities that may exceed human technological advantages in specific environmental contexts." Preston maintained tactical alertness while we analyzed our documentation, his military training emphasizing the continued dangers of our situation. Despite the apparently peaceful nature of our encounter, we remained in territory controlled by beings whose full capabilities remained unknown. The fact that they had chosen to reveal themselves suggested confidence in their ability to manage any potential threats we might represent. "We need to consider the implications of what just happened," he said. "These beings have maintained secrecy for centuries, possibly millennia. Our documentation provides proof of their existence, but it also represents the end of their isolation. Once this evidence becomes public, their territory will be invaded by researchers, government agencies, and curiosity seekers. We may have just destroyed the very thing we sought to study." The ethical dimensions of our discovery created moral complexity none of us had anticipated. Scientific evidence demanded publication and peer review, but revealing the being's existence would inevitably lead to their territory being overrun by human activity. They had clearly chosen concealment as their survival strategy, and our documentation threatened to eliminate that option permanently. As we began our withdrawal from the territory, I found myself grappling with questions that had no clear answers. Did we have the right to expose beings who had successfully avoided human contact for so long? What would happen to their culture, their territorial integrity, their very survival once scientific and governmental institutions became aware of their existence? The return journey passed in contemplative silence, each of us processing the magnitude of what we had experienced. The evidence we carried would establish our credibility and potentially launch new fields of scientific inquiry, but it would also irrevocably alter the lives of beings who had never consented to such exposure. By the time we reached the trailhead parking area, afternoon shadows were lengthening across the asphalt. The familiar sight of automobiles and paved roads felt surreal after hours in territory that belonged to another species entirely. We were returning to human civilization with proof that intelligence had evolved along multiple paths, that our planet harbored conscious beings whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness. So, over the following weeks, we engaged in extensive debate about how to present our discoveries. Jamie's photographs and Marcus's audio recordings provided documentation that would convince any objective analysis, but we recognized that public revelation would create consequences extending far beyond scientific recognition. Ultimately, we decided to approach a select group of anthropologists and wildlife biologists, sharing our evidence under strict confidentiality agreements that would allow scientific evaluation while protecting the being's territorial security. The response was immediate and profound. Leading researchers confirmed that our documentation represented evidence of an unknown hominid species with capabilities that exceeded theoretical models for non-human intelligence. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a primatologist from the University of Utah, spent 3 days analyzing our materials before delivering her assessment. What you've documented appears to be a relic hominid population that survived the evolutionary bottlenecks that led to human dominance, she explained. Their tool use, territorial organization, and linguistic capabilities suggest cognitive development parallel to early human societies, but adapted for complete concealment rather than technological advancement. The scientific community's excitement was matched by growing pressure for public disclosure and expanded research programs. Government agencies began expressing interest in our discoveries, though their motivations seemed more focused on territorial control than species protection. The beings we had encountered with such care suddenly became subjects of institutional planning that paid little attention to their obvious desire for privacy. 6 months after our final expedition, I returned alone to the forest that had changed my understanding of the world. The territory showed clear signs of abandonment. The tool caches had been cleared, the shelters dismantled, the engineering projects systematically destroyed. Whatever populations had inhabited the area for possibly thousands of years had recognized the threat represented by our documentation and responded with complete withdrawal. Standing in the empty clearing where we had experienced first contact with another intelligent species, I felt the full weight of what we had lost through our desire for scientific recognition. The beings were gone, probably relocated to more remote territory where human encroachment would be less likely. Their culture, their territorial knowledge, their unique perspective on intelligence and survival, all had vanished to preserve their continued existence. The photographs and recordings remained, providing permanent documentation of their reality. But the living connection, the possibility of learning from beings who had solved evolutionary challenges through completely different approaches, had been severed by our inability to resist the human compulsion to expose and categorize the unknown. As I walked back toward human civilization, I understood that some discoveries carry responsibilities that extend beyond scientific curiosity. The beings I had encountered possessed their own rights to privacy, territory, and self-determination. Our documentation had protected their reality from dismissal, but it had also ended their isolation forever. The forest closed behind me, keeping its remaining secrets, while I carried the burden of knowledge that could never be shared without destroying what it sought to preserve. In the distance, a single, haunting vocalization echoed between the hills. Perhaps a final farewell. Perhaps a warning that some mysteries are meant to remain hidden in the shadows of human understanding. The terror I had initially felt had transformed into something deeper and more lasting. The recognition that intelligence takes many forms, and that wisdom sometimes requires accepting limits on human knowledge and control. As civilization's lights appeared ahead, I carried with me the profound understanding that we share this world with others whose presence challenges everything we believe about consciousness, evolution, and our place in the natural order. Some truths are too significant to reveal, too dangerous to ignore, and too important to forget. My name is Jeremiah Holt. I'm a divorced mechanic with no kids, living in a small town near the Ozark Mountains. I've always been a bit of a loner, finding solace in the quiet of nature rather than the bustle of town life. That's why I bought that little cabin up in the woods a few years back. It was nothing fancy, just a simple one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a cramped bathroom. But it was mine, and it was my escape. I remember the day everything changed like it was yesterday. It was October 12th, 1999, the start of deer season. Though I owned a hunting rifle, I wasn't much of a hunter myself. For me, the season was more an excuse to retreat to my cabin, enjoy the crisp autumn air, and maybe have a few beers by the campfire. The drive up to the cabin that day was uneventful. The narrow, winding road snaked through the mountains, fiery fall colors painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and gold. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt the familiar sense of peace wash over me. The woods were old here, ancient really. They had a presence about them, a weight of history and secrets that both calmed and intrigued me. I spent the first few days doing what I always did, hiking the nearby trails, chopping firewood, and fixing up little things around the cabin. There was always something that needed attention. This time it was a leaky spot in the roof that I patched up. The work felt good, honest. It was a far cry from the complex engines and stubborn customers I dealt with back in town. Evenings were my favorite. I'd sit on the small porch, nursing a cold beer, watching the sun set behind the trees. The forest would come alive with night sounds, owls hooting, crickets chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I first noticed something was off. It started with a feeling, really. A prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the isolation. But then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones, circling the cabin. At first, I figured it must be some drunk hunter who'd gotten turned around in the dark. It wouldn't be the first time someone had stumbled upon my little slice of paradise by accident. I called out, "Hey there! You lost?" My voice echoed in the darkness, but there was no response, just an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up even the usual nighttime sounds. I waited, straining my ears for any noise, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, common enough in these parts. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I woke early, the events of the previous night still nagging at me. I decided to take a look around the cabin, just to ease my mind. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the soft earth around the cabin. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before, and I'd seen plenty of animal tracks in my time. These were big, much larger than a bear's, with long curved claw marks at the end of each toe. The stride length was immense, suggesting whatever made them was tall, really tall. As I followed the tracks, I noticed something else. Tufts of fur snagged on a low-hanging branch near one of the windows. It was coarse and dark, unlike any animal fur I recognized. Shit. My gut churned with a mix of fear and curiosity. Something wasn't right here, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was wrong. As a precaution, I went inside and loaded my hunting rifle. Better safe than sorry, I thought. That night, things escalated. The noises returned, but this time they were unmistakable. Something was out there, something big. I could hear it moving around the cabin, its heavy footfalls crunching on the fallen leaves. Then came the scratching, a horrific sound of claws dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin. I sat rigid in my chair by the fireplace, rifle clutched in my sweaty hands. The scratching moved from wall to wall, circling the cabin. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite... well, I didn't know what. Gathering my courage, I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows across the yard, and in those dancing shadows I saw it. A hulking silhouette, far too tall to be natural, its head cocked at an odd angle as if it were studying the cabin. Studying me. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. I'm not a man who scares easily.
I've faced down angry customers and even a few barroom brawls in my day. But this was something else entirely. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. I decided I needed to do something, to chase it off somehow. With shaking hands, I moved to the door, planning to fire a warning shot over its head. But the moment I cracked open the door, I froze. There it was, crouched on my porch, not 10 feet away from me. In that moment, bathed in the warm glow of the firelight spilling from the open door, I got my first real look at the creature. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe it accurately. It's as if my mind rebels against the memory, trying to protect me from the sheer otherworldliness of what I saw. It was massive, easily as tall as me, even in its crouched position, and I stand over 6 feet. Its body was lean, but corded with rippling muscles visible beneath a hide of taut, leathery skin. The arms were too long for its body, ending in hands tipped with claws that looked sharp enough to gut a deer in one swipe. Those claws dripped with some dark, viscous fluid that I prayed wasn't blood. But it was the creature's head that truly horrified me. It had a long, wolfish snout filled with row upon row of jagged teeth, each one looking sharp enough to tear through bone. Its nose was split, reminiscent of a snake's, flaring as it sniffed the air. And the eyes, God, those eyes. They were a sickly yellow color, glowing with an unnatural light and filled with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. This wasn't just some animal. There was a calculating, predatory mind behind those eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my finger frozen on the trigger of my rifle. The creature studied me, its head tilting this way and that, like a curious dog. Then it let out a hiss, a sound so alien and terrifying that it broke me from my trance. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely throw the lock. Cursing myself for not taking the shot when I had the chance, I quickly moved to barricade the door with whatever furniture I could drag over. All the while, I could hear the creature outside, circling the cabin, those heavy footsteps punctuated by occasional scratches against the walls and windows. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in a corner, rifle aimed at the door, jumping at every sound. Those glowing eyes peered in through the windows periodically, watching, waiting. I've never felt so hunted, so utterly vulnerable, in all my life. When the first rays of sunlight finally began to filter through the windows, the noises outside ceased. I waited for what felt like hours, ears straining for any sound of the creature's presence. Finally, when the sun was well and truly up, I gathered the courage to look outside. The area around the cabin looked like a war zone. Deep furrows were carved into the earth, trees bore deep scratch marks, and in several places, I found more of that coarse, dark fur. But what caught my attention were the tracks, the same enormous clawed footprints I'd seen the day before. They led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I knew I should leave, pack up my things and get the hell out of there. But something held me back. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just couldn't believe what had happened and needed some kind of proof. Whatever the reason, I found myself following those tracks into the forest. The trail led me deeper into the woods than I'd ever ventured before. The trees grew denser, older, their gnarled branches blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was trying to warn me away. Still, I pressed on, following those massive footprints. After about an hour of hiking, I came upon a small clearing. There, half hidden by thick underbrush, was the mouth of a cave. The tracks led directly to it, disappearing into the inky blackness beyond. The entrance was larger than I expected, easily big enough for something as large as the creature I'd seen to pass through comfortably. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but standing there, staring into that yawning darkness, I felt a deep sense of wrongness. This place didn't feel natural. The air around the cave entrance was noticeably cooler, and there was a faint, acrid smell that made my nose wrinkle. I wasn't completely reckless.
I knew better than to venture into an unknown cave, especially one that might house the creature I'd encountered. So I kept my distance, observing from the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Just outside the cave entrance, partially hidden by some low bushes, was a pile of bones. At first glance, I thought they might be deer bones, not uncommon in these woods. But as I looked closer, I realized with growing horror that not all of them were animal bones. Some were unmistakably human. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing. How long had this thing been out here? How many people had fallen victim to it? And why hadn't anyone noticed? As these questions swirled in my head, a movement at the cave entrance caught my eye. Something was emerging from the darkness. Time seemed to slow as the creature stepped into the dim light of the clearing. It was even more terrifying in broad daylight, its true form no longer hidden by shadows. But what it was dragging behind it, that's the image that still haunts my nightmares. It was the body of a man, or what was left of him. He was dressed in hunter's orange, his clothes torn and soaked with blood. One of his legs was missing entirely, and his face. I try not to remember his face. I stood there, frozen in horror, as the creature dropped its grisly prize near the pile of bones. It then turned, those yellow eyes locking onto me with terrifying intelligence. In that moment, I knew it had been aware of my presence the entire time. It had led me here deliberately, wanting me to see this. My paralysis broke, and I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, my lungs burning and legs shaking from exertion. As I burst into the clearing around my cabin, I chanced to look back. There, at the edge of the trees, stood the creature. It wasn't chasing me. It just stood there, watching, those yellow eyes boring into me. Somehow that was even more terrifying than if it had pursued me. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my duffel bag. I didn't start to calm down until I was miles down the mountain road, the familiar sights of civilization coming into view. My first stop was the sheriff's office. I knew I couldn't tell them everything, they'd think I was crazy, so I spun a tale about a rogue bear, aggressive and unnaturally large. I mentioned the hunter's body, describing it as a mauling. I could tell they didn't fully believe me, but they took my statement seriously enough to send a search party up to the area. They never found anything, of course. No bodies, no abnormally large animal tracks, nothing. They chalked it up to poachers operating out of season, and possibly me being a bit jumpy alone in the woods. They told me to let them know if I saw anything suspicious again. I sold that cabin as quickly as I could, practically giving it away. I couldn't stand the thought of owning it anymore, of anyone else staying there unaware of what lurked in those woods. I've never gone back to those mountains, and I never will. It's been years since that October night, but the memory of what I saw never fades. Some nights I wake in a cold sweat, certain I can see those yellow eyes watching me from the dark corners of my room. I've moved to a different town, tried to start over, but the fear lingers. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night and pass a particularly dense patch of woods, I can't help but wonder, is it out there? Has it spread beyond those Ozark forests? Is it hunting even now, adding to that gruesome pile of bones in its cave? I don't know if what I encountered was some undiscovered animal, a creature from Native American legend come to life, or something even more inexplicable. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of what we think we know. And once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never unsee them. So I leave you with this warning. Be careful in the deep woods. Respect the old forests and the secrets they keep. And if you're ever alone in the wilderness and feel that prickling sensation of being watched, trust your instincts. Run, and don't look back. Because sometimes the monsters are real. When I decided to take a break from city life, I never imagined it would lead me to this. I had always been a bit of an adventurous soul, but after a particularly grueling project at work, I needed some serious downtime. So I packed up my RV and headed out to the rugged terrains of Nevada, hoping to find some peace and quiet among the canyons and deserts. My name's Alex Reeves. I've seen my fair share of hard times, grew up in a rough neighborhood in Detroit, worked my way through college, and carved out a decent career for myself as a software engineer in San Francisco. But stress has a way of creeping up on you, no matter how tough you think you are. That's why this trip was supposed to be my sanctuary, a chance to recharge away from the chaos of daily life. The campsite I chose was about as remote as you could get without falling off the map entirely. A small, tucked-away corner of Great Basin National Park, known more for its ancient bristlecone pines and solitude than for human activity. It was perfect. Or so I thought. I arrived just before noon, the sun high and relentless in the clear blue sky. The landscape was a breathtaking array of browns and greens, with towering limestone cliffs and deep winding canyons that seemed to stretch forever. I parked the RV in a small clearing, the only signs of civilization being a narrow dirt road that led back to the highway and a weathered old sign warning travelers about the rugged terrain. After setting up camp, I decided to explore a bit. There was a narrow path leading into one of the nearby canyons that looked intriguing. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water, snacks, and my trusty map, and set off. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind or distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, though, in a way that the city could never be. The canyon was even more impressive up close. The walls soared high above, creating a cool, shaded pathway that felt like a secret world hidden away from the rest of the earth. I wandered for hours, completely losing track of time, captivated by the natural beauty and the sense of isolation. Slope. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself deeper in the canyon than I had planned. The light began to fade, and with it, the temperature dropped. I decided it was time to head back. But that's when I realized I wasn't entirely sure which way back was. The twists and turns of the canyon had disoriented me, and my map wasn't much help without clear landmarks. Trying not to panic, I retraced my steps as best I could. Every corner looked the same, every rock and bush blending into the next. I cursed under my breath, frustration mounting. Just as I was beginning to seriously worry, I saw it, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, or maybe an animal, but then I saw it again, clearer this time. A person, moving quickly through the shadows up ahead. Relief washed over me. Maybe they could help me find my way back. "Hey!" I called out, picking up my pace to catch up. "Hey, wait up!" The figure stopped and turned, and I saw him for the first time. He was a tall man, rugged and wiry, dressed in worn-out clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. His face was gaunt, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. There was something unsettling about him, but I pushed the thought aside. Right now, I needed directions more than I needed to worry about making friends. "Can you help me?" I asked, a bit breathless as I reached him. "I'm lost trying to get back to the main campsite." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and started walking, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated, but decided to trust him. What choice did I have? We walked in silence, the canyon walls seeming to close in around us as the light continued to fade. The man's pace was brisk, almost hurried, and I had to struggle to keep up. Something about his demeanor set me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a wider section of the canyon, where the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground. The man stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and for the first time, I noticed the knife at his belt. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough and low. "Alex," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for helping me out. I really appreciate it." He nodded slowly, but there was no warmth in his eyes. You shouldn't be out here alone, Alex. Dangerous place. I swallowed hard, the unease growing stronger. Yeah, I guess I didn't think it through. Just needed some time away, you know? He took a step closer, and I instinctively took a step back. Time away from what? Work? Life? Everything, I said, forcing a smile. Figured the middle of nowhere was a good place to clear my head. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. Middle of nowhere is where people disappear, Alex. Nobody hears them scream out here. My heart pounded in my chest. Look, I really should get back to my RV. It's getting late. He shook his head, his smile widening. Not tonight. Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife flashing in the dying light. I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward and falling hard against the rocky ground. Pain shot through my arm, but adrenaline kicked in and I scrambled to my feet, instinctively reaching for a rock to defend myself. "Stay away from me," I shouted, brandishing the rock like a makeshift weapon. The man laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "You're not getting out of here alive, Alex. Nobody does." He lunged again, and this time I wasn't quick enough. The knife slashed across my arm, a searing pain that brought tears to my eyes. But I fought back, swinging the rock with all my might and connecting with his head. He staggered, dazed, and I took the opportunity to run. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding, blood dripping from my arm. The narrow canyon walls seemed to close in around me, and I felt like I was being swallowed by the earth itself. I could hear his footsteps behind me, relentless, and the sound of his laughter growing louder. I turned a corner and saw a small crevice in the rock, just big enough for me to squeeze through. Without thinking, I dove into it, wedging myself into the narrow space and praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. His voice echoed through the canyon. "You can't hide forever." I held my breath, the pain in my arm throbbing in time with my heartbeat. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally I heard his footsteps retreat. I waited longer still, until the canyon was silent once more. When I was sure he was gone, I crawled out of the crevice, my body aching and my mind racing. I had to get back to the RV, had to get help. I stumbled through the canyon, every shadow making me jump, every sound sending a spike of fear through me. But I kept going, driven by sheer willpower and the desperate need to survive. Yes. It was nearly dawn by the time I finally saw it, the glint of metal in the early light, the shape of my RV parked in the clearing. I staggered towards it, my vision blurring, my strength nearly gone. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine and floored it, the RV lurching forward with a roar. As I sped down the dirt road, leaving the canyon and the nightmare behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me go. His face was twisted in a snarl of rage, but he didn't follow. He just watched, his eyes burning with hatred. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I finally called the police. They found the canyon and the crevice I had hidden in, but the man was gone, vanished without a trace. They took my statement, and I gave them all the details I could remember. But it felt like a blur, a twisted, surreal nightmare that I could barely believe had happened. But it had. The scars on my arm were proof enough, and the memory of his cold, piercing eyes would haunt me forever. Life went on, as it always does. I went back to work, tried to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But there were nights when I couldn't sleep, when the silence felt too much like the canyon, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I didn't go camping again, not for a long time, and when I did, it was never alone. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Part of me still can't believe it happened. But it did. And I'll never forget that man's face, or the sound of his laughter echoing through the canyon. As I sit here, years later, I can't help but wonder about that man. Who was he? What drove him to such madness? And how many others might have fallen victim to his twisted game in that remote wilderness? The questions haunt me, but I know I'll never have the answers. Sometimes, when the city feels too crowded and I long for open spaces, I remember that night. The terror, yes, but also the raw, primal feeling of fighting for survival. It changed me, in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that can lurk in seemingly peaceful places. But I'm also stronger, more resilient. I survived something I never thought I could, and that knowledge gives me strength. Chua. I still love nature, still feel the call of the wild, but now I approach it with respect, with caution, and with the understanding that beauty and danger often go hand in hand. My experience in that canyon was a stark reminder of our vulnerability in the face of nature's indifference and human cruelty.